All right, hello everyone. So here's a little video that's going to cover the beginning of the evolution notes. Talk a little bit about Darwin, some evidences of evolution, and some of the precursors um, before Darwin. So now, evolution is simply put, it's just change in something, and more specifically, we're going to talk about organisms over time. Okay. Um, And these changes can be, and they're usually in the form of adaptations. These changes happen on populations, not necessarily just individuals. So just because one is slightly different doesn't mean that that's the whole species, that whole population is changing. All right. Evolution happens on a much grander scale, so we need a larger, than just a singular one, like zebra, for example. Okay. There are going to be multiple zebras that are going to be changed, and that would be the evolution or the evolving of the zebra population. All right, so a few jokers that we need to talk about. John Baptiste de Lamarck. All right, so his idea was that if you needed it, you were going to get it. All right, so this is this idea of like, well, I need a longer neck, so I'm going to stretch and I will acquire this long neck. Okay, so this idea that we are acquiring traits. Okay, this is not how this works. We either have them or we don't from birth. All right, there's no, oh, I'm gonna get this one if I want it. Like, oh, I need some wings. I'm gonna sprout wings. All right, it doesn't work like that. Okay, we kind of had this idea that I always give the example of a giraffe's neck, right? If a giraffe needed a longer neck, it's going to stretch and develop a longer neck. That's not how it happens, all right? Evolution works on what we were born with, which is just genetic variances in the population. So some giraffes have longer necks than others. Long-necked giraffes were able to get the food, live longer. Short-necked giraffes were not able to get as much food, they die out. Since they live longer, they have more babies. Over time, the short-necked giraffes die out. Long-necked giraffes population goes up, and we're left with long-necked giraffes. All right, Charles Lyell wrote the Principles of Geology. His work very much influenced Darwin because he had these principles and ideas that were based in geology. Proposed that plants and animals arise, developed variances, and became extinct over time. So right around now, we're starting to find fossils and things like that. Okay, we're starting to realize that there are more animals that have been on this earth than what we see, in the 1800s. And he has this idea that the earth is constantly changing over long periods of time. It is not this sedentary set thing. Most of us remember this idea of Pangea, all right, which is true, plate tectonics and all that. So the earth is constantly changing, all right. It is not this rigid thing that has never changed and has been the exact same for approximately 4.5 billion years. All right, it's constantly changing. All right, Wallace. The idea of competition was for resources is the main force in natural selection, which is true. Whether that competition be for food, mates, shelter, whatever the case may be, if you can outcompete somebody, all right, then you get the resource. If you can't outcompete them, you don't, all right? And if you can't outcompete enough of them, you don't get resources, food, all these other things, you shall perish. All right, and then we get to Darwin, okay? So, a collection of data that leads him to come up with this theory of natural selection, okay? This theory is based on reproductive success, all right? When we say survival of the fittest, what we mean by fitness, all right, is actually, by definition, the fitness in evolution sense doesn't mean they can run a mile in under 4 minutes. It means that they're babies, they have lots of babies, and those babies can have babies. The more babies you have, the more fit you are, okay? All of this stuff, Lyle, Malthus, Mendel, the other guys that we talked about, Wallace, all of these guys really helped Darwin come up with his theory and publish his paper in his book, The Origin of Species. All right, some things about Darwin's theory of natural selection. You notice that the environment played a massive role in evolution. Okay, so the environment plays a huge role. Whether what we get, what we can compete for, how well are we adapted to that environment, is going to play a huge role in this evolution. Because if we are not adapted well to live in whatever environment, then we're going to die. Okay, if we can't, like I said, talked about, if we can't compete well in the environment, all right, it's not going to go well. Okay, like a small finch is not going to compete well in the Alaskan plains. All right, these are rough, harsh conditions, and finches are small, fairly fragile birds. Okay, they're not going to do well. Okay, as everything else, environments over time change, and therefore the organisms in it change. Okay, we are not the same. We know from fossil records that organisms that were alive and did well millions of years ago no longer are alive and would not do well now today. Okay, adaptations and variations exist. All right, adaptations is anything that helps us be more well suited to the environment, and a variation is just any variation. Could be color variation, could be claws, could be, 1,000 different things. Variance is just within the population, all the same species, we have things that look different and act different. Okay. All right, HMS Beagle, this is what he was riding on when he went around the Galapagos Islands. Now, the thing about the Galapagos Islands and why they're important as far as helping him come to these conclusions, all right? Each of these islands you see here are very different. Ooh, don't know what happened there with that thing, all right? All these islands are very different geologically, okay? They all, like, some are very volcanic. They've been around for a very long time. Or the younger ones are very volcanic, very rocky, not a lot of vegetation, very harsh climates. Some of them have been around for a while. They have nice plants growing on them. They have lush vegetation. Okay, so each one of these islands is very different. Now, the important thing is, and why this is cool, is because since each of them are different, they each have a variation of the same species, or a different variation of, and ultimately a different species of a very common ancestral like plan of tortoise. One of the two big ones that we talked about are tortoise and the finches, which is a type of bird. Okay, so on these islands, there's different food sources, all right, different topography, different geology, all of these things. So each one is going to have a slightly different type of bird living on it, and tortoise. So, Galapagos Islands. These are a tiny group of islands that probably influenced Darwin the most. Although they were close together, their climates, their environments, everything was very, very different. Okay. Now, since there was such high variety in such a small amount of area, what was causing that? All right, we know that now, of course, to be the climate and the environment. Okay. So we'll talk about the tortoises and we'll talk some about the finches as well. Okay. So you can see here you have one like ancestral bird, all right, and then you have all these variances depending on what is available on the island. Okay, if you got buds and fruits, they have more of a hooked beak. If you got leaves and vegetation, all right, you got a little pointy beak. If you got insects like grubs and things like that, you have a longer pointy beak. That way you can dig in and kind of get there. All right, if you got a short stocky beak, some of them involved mental adaptations to help them dig with tools and things like that. All right, so here's a whole bunch of different ones that you find on the Galapagos Islands. All right, these whole bunch of different species of this variance of one basic ancestral species. All right, so examples here is with the giant tortoises, you have different size or different shapes of the turtle shells, depending on their region, okay, and what they eat. Some of them have this very high back, right here, all right, they can actually crane their necks way up because there's not a lot of vegetation on the ground. Okay, with ones like this where you don't have that high dome, they have a lot of vegetation low, so they don't have to crane their neck up. There's no need for that. So you see right here, this little hump allows them to lift their heads up higher to get this vegetation. As you can see, right, not a whole lot to eat on the ground, but there's plenty to eat right here. Okay, so plenty to eat up top, not a lot to eat on the bottom, so they have to be able to crane that neck up. All right, so evolution by natural selection. Struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest. Remember, we talked about what fittest means is really it's more about, all right, fittest means the ability to have babies that are going to have babies. It is a mechanism for the population to change and occurs when organisms within certain variations, so differences between the populations, survive, reproduce, and pass on their variations to the next generation. All right, so what is in Darwin's theory of natural selection, what does a population need to do? They need to over-reproduce because not all of them are going to live. All right, variations exist. The variations are inherited. We talked about this from Mendel. Okay, our variations are good, and but they have to be passed down. If variations can't be passed down, then they're just they're only good for the person, not for the species. Organisms suited to their environment live longer and reproduce more, and populations change and become better adapted to whatever environment they live in. All right, so that's long enough for this video. We'll stop this one. I'll do another one on evidence of evolution.